This morning we'll be continuing the series that we've been doing in the book of 2Corinthians. So the past 7 months or so, I've been covering the first 7 chapters of this book. If you recall, some time ago now, I sort of gave a very high-level structure of the book, and I mentioned that chapters 1 to 7 were largely focused on Paul's reconciliation with the Corinthians after having all the troubles in 1 Corinthians and his what he called his sorrowful visit that he made to them, where obviously things didn't go too well. Titus has gone to Corinth and he's brought good tidings to Paul, who is now in Macedonia. And the good tidings are that the Corinthians have largely repented of the many problems and issues that they'd been dealing with. And so that these first 7 chapters, at least, of the book were Paul's letter of reconciliation and further encouragement to those who were repentant in the congregation. If we sort of remember some of the general themes, because in chapter 8 now, he's starting a new subject. So if we remember some of the general themes that he had been talking about in the first 7 chapters of reconciliation, he's always talking about his physical sufferings for the sake of Christ. That came up several times in the first 7 chapters. The physical sufferings and persecutions that he'd been undergoing, which many of the what we'll see are what he called the super apostles, in a sarcastic sense, what they were looking down on it with contempt, that Paul was persecuted, that he was regarded as a vagabond. They were looking down on him for that. He's reminding them that no, those with spiritual eyes should see that suffering for Christ is something to be proud of, to realise that is something God has called him to do for the sake of the gospel, and that there is no reason to be ashamed in physical suffering for Christ. That's part of his reconciliation with the Corinthians, to remind them again to see things with spiritual eyes. And of course, he's also spent a fair bit of time just talking about his personal circumstances, because it is a very personal letter. In his reconciliation with the Corinthians, he talks about his travels, his itinerary, the concerns that his personal concerns about he has been suffering a lot. It hasn't been easy for him. He's reminded them of all those things throughout the first 7 chapters. But of course, he's gone up to Macedonia now after what happened in Ephesus with Demetrius the silversmith and so on. He's in Macedonia now. Titus has come and met him there with the good tidings that they have repented. Now, in chapter 8 and 9, he deals with a more concrete subject. Chapters 1 to 7 is sort of hard to follow sometimes because it flips around a fair bit between what he's talking about. Chapters 8 and 9 are largely to do with this matter of giving. There's a collection that Paul is running we'll see it's the church in Jerusalem, and chapters 8 and 9 are focused specifically on that subject, so it's a bit easier to follow than what we've seen in the past. So let's turn to, in our Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and we'll just quickly skip down to verse 10 and 11, because that's really the key starting point for these 2 chapters. 2 Corinthians 8 verses 10 and 11, because he says, "I give my opinion in this matter, for this is to your advantage," and this is the part here, "who were the first to begin a year ago, not only to do this, but also to desire to do it." And we'll see that is this collection. They were the first to, not only to begin to do it, but to desire to do it. And Paul says in verse 11, "But now finish doing it also, so that just as there was the readiness in desire to do it, there may also be the completion of it by your ability." So that is the key message or the theme for these 2 chapters, that they had started this work, this collection, this giving, but Paul is saying, you've started it, now you need to finish it. Now, we can flick back to 1 Corinthians 16 to see the genesis of this whole idea. In 1 Corinthians 16, which is the passage that we do use as authority for giving, says in 1 Corinthians 16 verse 1, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so do you also. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save as he may prosper." That there is Paul's command to the church in Corinth, just as it's to the churches of Galatia, so he preaches everywhere. There is the command there. On the first day of every week, each of us is to put aside and save. But also here in 1 Corinthians 16 verse 2, at the end there, he finishes that sentence off with, "so that no collections be made when I come." Now what's he talking about when I come? Because there is something special there, isn't there? That, well, why is Paul having anything to do with the collection that Corinth is running? He's talking specifically here about a special collection that's being run, and as we'll see later on, it's not part. It is something that should be run on the first day of the week as he commands, but the purpose that this one is being used for is actually something else altogether. I'll dig into that in a moment. And sorry, I'm reading off my phone. I had plans to have a laptop and a projector, and it's all fallen apart, so that's why I'm reading off my phone and I'm struggling to read it. So if we can turn back to 2 Corinthians, stay in 1 Corinthians 16. Just if we read verse 3 as well, right? "When I arrive, whomever you may approve, I will send them with letters to carry your gift to Jerusalem." That's in 1 Corinthians 16 verse 3. This collection that he's running, he's coming to Corinth, and remember his plans had changed, right? He was going to come to Corinth and then do other things, but it didn't go as intended. When he wrote this, his plans were still intact as originally intended, right? He's still in Ephesus when he wrote this letter. The uproar in Ephesus hasn't occurred yet. He has written this letter with an intent that he would be coming to Corinth soon to deal with this matter of the collection with the church. That didn't happen as he had planned it to go. But I guess there's two things that we can read from what we've seen in chapter 16 here, as well as in 2 Corinthians 8, and that is that there is a special collection being run, that Paul is coming to collect this special gift. And firstly, we can ask who it's for. We can see in verse 3 that it's for the saints in Jerusalem. We might ask, well, why? What has resulted in this need for a special collection to be made for the saints in Jerusalem? Now, I think we can make some pretty good guesses at what's going on in Jerusalem. Firstly, let's turn to Acts chapter 8. In Acts chapter 8 verse 1, when the persecution starts in Jerusalem and Judea, Saul was in hearty agreement with putting him to death, and on that day a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. So this persecution obviously commenced fairly, it would have been some time prior to Paul writing this letter, but I think it's fair to say that it was probably still going on. Jerusalem as a city was still intact, it hadn't been destroyed. The Jews would have been persecuting those Christians who still resided in Jerusalem. So there's an ongoing persecution, I think, that started, as we read about in Acts chapter 8, and it's still ongoing at the time that Paul wrote 2 Corinthians. The other thing is, there may in fact have also been a famine at the time, or around that time. If we turn to Acts 11, verse 27, It says, at this time some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would certainly be a great famine all over the world. And this took place in the reign of Claudius. So yes, there is a famine taking place. In addition to the persecution that was taking place in Jerusalem, there would have been a famine. Yes, the famine would have been widespread, but the people in Jerusalem would have been particularly hard hit by it because of the persecution that would have also been happening. And then we can go even further back to the time of Jesus and see what Jesus said about this, because he made a prophecy about this very thing taking place in Matthew 24. Let's go there. Now, for those of us who have studied Matthew 24, we know that certainly the first half or thereabouts is actually to do with Jerusalem. It's not to do with end times or anything like that. Jesus was asked about Jerusalem, and he responds in regarding Jerusalem, the city. And in Matthew 24, starting in verse 4, Jesus responds to that question from his disciples, and he says, "See that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many." Now this must be in Jerusalem. He's been asked about that city, which he says, "Not one stone will be left upon another." He's talking about in that city there will be many false Christs. In verse 6, "You'll be hearing of wars and rumours of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. In various places there will be famines," just read about famine, "and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all the nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and will mislead many." So I think that the exact year that 2 Corinthians was written, I don't recall if it's in the 50s or the 60s, but that time is approaching, 70 AD, the cutoff, when God will wipe away that city and that nation of the Jews. And these things that Jesus prophesied about would have been occurring in that city: the false Christs, the persecutions, the false prophets misleading many. And the church that is in Jerusalem has to deal with all that. And the famine, they have to deal with all that. The greater persecution that happened in the Roman Empire, we can read it's happening, but I think that it's not as severe outside of Jerusalem as it is at that point in time. Jerusalem is the epicenter of Christian persecution at this point in time. And so that's why that's why there is this collection being run. And I was about to say that's why Paul was running this collection, but we shouldn't say that, because we have to remember that it was the Corinthians who came up with the idea. We just read that in chapter 8. They were the first, not just to do it, but to desire to do it. It was their idea to support these saints in Jerusalem. The other thing I wanted to mention, right, if we can probably go back to 2 Corinthians now, is in verse 10, right, where it says, "For this is to your advantage, who were the first to begin a year ago, not only to do this, but to desire to do it," is the timing. It says they were the first to begin to desire this a year ago. So it's actually been a year that they came up with the idea, and a year later, it's still a valid concern. Not only has it not been finished, but it's actually still needed. So it's obviously not just a quick fix or something like that. This support is actually needed. It's been needed for over a year because of all the things that's happening in Jerusalem. So there's a serious problem that's going on there. It's a long-term problem that the saints in that city need the support. And then I mentioned earlier when I was reading in 1 Corinthians 16 verse 3 about the logistics of this. Paul is very careful here in verse 3 of 1 Corinthians and also here in 2 Corinthians. He's very careful to not give the impression that he is running this matter. Because we remember all of the accusations that had been made against Paul. And we'll cover that as well later in this particular book. But Paul, he's been accused of not being a real apostle. He's been accused of vacillating with his travel plans. He's been accused of being a vagabond, being kicked from one city into the next. He is not going to assert his authority as an apostle to run this collection, because the last thing he wants is now for people to say, oh, well, Paul just wants the money for himself, which is exactly what he's accused of, as we'll read about, Lord willing, we get there in a few months in chapter 11. That's the accusation made against Paul, that he wants the money for himself. So he is being very clear, hands off. He's not doing anything about this collection unless it's directly approved by the brethren in Corinth. And that's why he says, whoever you may approve, if it is fitting for me to go also, and things like that. He says these things because he's not going to take ownership of this matter. It is not in that sense of logistics. So that's the theme of these two chapters. This collection, this special collection that's being run for the saints in Jerusalem, because of the persecutions. Possibly the famine is still ongoing, the one that Agabus prophesied about, things like that. And it's a long-going persecution that's happening in the city. And so Paul is running this, and it's a special collection, right? It's over and above, and we'll see that as well. It's over and above what the standard weekly collection is, because for a start, it's been planned for a year. When we do our collections, it's something that we're doing every week for a known purpose. This is something that goes beyond that. And we'll see as well later on that Paul's very careful not to give them any authoritative directions in this matter. We'll see this chapter is about exhortation and encouragement and leading by example. But Paul's not giving them, he's not asserting his authority as an apostle for them to actually run this special collection for the saints in Jerusalem. So now, having said all that, starting in verse 1 of the chapter, let's see the first thing Paul says about how he encourages them to run this collection. He gives them the example of the people in Macedonia, which is where he was residing at the time. He uses the Macedonians as an example to the Corinthians. It says in verse 1, "Now, brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace of God, which has been given in the churches of Macedonia, that in a great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. For I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave of their own accord, begging us with much urging for the favour of participation in the support of the saints. And this not as we had expected, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. So we urge Titus that as he had previously made a beginning, so he would also complete in you this gracious work as well." So, firstly, yes, we mentioned already that the church in Jerusalem was undergoing persecutions and famines and so on, but the Macedonians were not doing too well either. It says in verse 2 that they have a great ordeal of affliction and that they are also in deep poverty. And it's interesting because the secular history would indicate that the region of Macedonia, in the time of the Roman Empire at least, was not poor. It was a relatively prosperous region of the Roman Empire. It had been considered a backwater some centuries prior to that, but in the time of the Roman Empire, Macedonia was by no means a poor region. And yet we have these saints here in Macedonia who are, Paul says, they're in deep poverty. Now we think about what we read about. If we've studied 1 Corinthians and as we are studying 2 Corinthians now, we actually don't read about any poverty on the side of the Corinthians. We never read about their lack of physical goods and things like that. So Paul is making an example here, isn't he, of encouragement. That he doesn't say it expressly anywhere, but he's making an example that these Macedonians who were in poverty were quite happy and willing to give, even beyond their means. They were very happy to support the church that was in Jerusalem. If we read on starting in verse 7 now, he says, "But just as you abound in everything, in faith and utterance and knowledge, and in all earnestness, and in the love we inspired in you, see that you abound in this gracious work also." Now, perhaps we would remember from 1 Corinthians, Paul spends a lot of time dealing with the matter of the spiritual gifts, and that's what he's referring to here. You abound in everything. So I've just mentioned that they're not poor. In fact, it sounds like they're quite wealthy. They abound in everything, but in faith, in utterance, and knowledge. Now that's talking about the spiritual gifts. And if we turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, when you can read chapters 12 and 13 and 14, all dealing with this matter of the spiritual gifts. The Corinthians had been blessed with many spiritual gifts. We can gather that from the context. The problem that they had was that they were being misused, and they were not being regarded with the correct attitude. They were lording it over one another, that they had these spiritual gifts. But in chapter 12, verse 4, Paul, he goes on and says, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of ministries and the same Lord. And there are varieties of effects, but the same God who works all things in all persons. But to each one is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. For to one is given the word of wisdom through the Spirit, and to another the word of knowledge according to the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, and to another gifts of healing by the one Spirit, and to another the effecting of miracles, and to another prophecy, and to another the distinguishing of spirits, and to another various kinds of tongues, and to another the interpretation of tongues. And so Paul goes on talking about all the spiritual gifts. Now, the Corinthians, I think it's safe to assume they would have had direct experience with all of these things that Paul has just listed here. Otherwise he wouldn't talk about it. They have been blessed with a large array of spiritual gifts. Compare that perhaps to the Romans, right? Where Paul, when he's writing them, and he says in chapter 1, it sounds like they haven't got too many spiritual gifts yet, because he has to say in Romans chapter 1, he wants to go there so that he may impart some gifts to them. The Corinthians had the opposite problem. They almost had like too many spiritual gifts. They had so many that they regarded it as, it became to them a source of pride and of boasting. So Paul has to correct them on that front. And so back to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, he's saying now, in verse 7, just as you abound in everything. So as I mentioned, there's no sign of any poverty. If anything, in a city like Corinth, it was a hub of the Roman world. They probably were, many of them would have been quite wealthy. They abound in everything, and in faith, and in utterance, and knowledge. There's spiritual gifts there. And then he goes on to say, in all earnestness, in the love we inspired in you, see that you abound in this gracious work also. So he's given them the Macedonian example, these people who were in affliction and in poverty, and they were willing to give. The Corinthians, who have so much more, how much more should they be willing to give to the benefit of the saints in Jerusalem? Now, let's keep reading. This is what I mentioned before, but Paul's not giving them any authority. And he's not ordering them to do anything. He's encouraging them. And he says in verse 8, I'm not speaking this as a command, but as proving through the earnestness of others the sincerity of your love also. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that through you through his poverty might become rich. There's another example that Paul gives, right? That, yes, the Macedonians have given so much. Actually, spiritually, how much more has Jesus Christ given to all of you? You who, they're halfway through this letter, you'd hope by now they would have picked up the message that Paul's focus is on the spiritual and not the physical. That all the physical things that he was going through were nothing compared to the spiritual blessings that he had in Christ. And by the same logic, they should have been getting the message by now that all the physical things that they had, the blessings that they had, were nothing compared to the spiritual blessings that they would have had in Christ. So that's another example of Paul exhorting them to complete this task, or this this task they had planned on doing. So reading on, to verse 8. I am not speaking this as a command, but as proving through the earnestness of others and sincerity of your love also. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. And now in verse 10, I give my opinion in this matter, for this is to your advantage, who were the first to begin a year ago, not only to do this, but also to desire to do it. But now finish doing it also, so that just as there was the readiness to desire it, there may also be the completion of it by your ability. For if the readiness is present, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. For this is not for the ease of others and for your own affliction, but by way of equality. Of this present time your abundance, being a supply for their need, so that their abundance may also become a supply for your need, and that there may be equality. As it is written, he who gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little had no lack. So here we see it said again by Paul that the Corinthians had an abundance, that they had no lack. But he's also being clear that because this is an optional collection that they're running, that he's not going to order them to do anything about it. He's rather going to encourage them. And also that it's not about making them suffer. They're not required to suffer for the sake of this collection. It's simply that those who were in Jerusalem were suffering greatly, and it was open to the Corinthians to help out fellow brethren in Christ. Now, when we compare perhaps some of the stories we read about outside the Bible about asceticism, the ascetics who would go and starve themselves or go live as hermits in the desert, put themselves on pillars and just live up there for years on end with people having to feed them. Now they're suffering, they're making themselves suffer. For what end? Paul says here, this collection is not for the purpose of making you suffer. You're not supposed to be in affliction because of it. You're just doing it because you see your brethren in need and you want to help them. The asceticism doesn't actually help anybody, doesn't serve anybody or any purpose. It's a totally pointless endeavour. Paul here is saying, you have the ability to give, you wanted to do it, why don't you finish off this now so you can help your brethren in Jerusalem? We can read in verse 16 yet another example that Paul gives the Corinthians as to why they should be finishing this collection. It says, "But thanks be to God who put the same earnestness on your behalf in the heart of Titus. For he has not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he has gone to you of his own accord." Now this might not sound like much, but we don't know much about Titus, whether he was wealthy or not. But this is another example of Titus doing his bit. He's just doing his bit to help, because maybe he doesn't have the funds to give to the church in Jerusalem. But he's helping out Paul, isn't he, in running this collection. That Titus, out of the liberality of his own heart, is going to help Paul run this collection. And maybe I should have said this before, but just try and remember the journeys that have taken place here, right? That after leaving Ephesus, Paul has gone up to Macedonia and he sent Titus to Corinth. And then Titus has gone from Corinth and met Paul up in Macedonia. And now we read Titus is actually going back to Corinth again. So Titus is doing a lot of traveling, just like Paul is doing. So he's come up to to Macedonia, met with Paul, given him a good report, and who knows how long Titus spent in Macedonia before Paul sent him back down again with this letter, and these directions regarding the collection. But the fact is, Titus was happy to go to do his bit to support this collection that was being run for the saints in Jerusalem. So there's another example that the Corinthians have, right? The Macedonians who were poor physically and going through persecution. Jesus Christ, who through his own spiritual poverty made them spiritually rich. And then Titus, who he's just one man, who's doing his bit to help out this collection for the saints. So Corinth, on the other hand, they've had all these problems. They've been fighting with Paul. They've got lots of good things. They've got lots of blessings, and they've had this great idea to support to run this collection for the saints in Jerusalem, and they've forgotten about it, and it's been left by the wayside. So Paul is using all these examples to encourage them to now finish this task that they had started. Now, in the last part of the chapter, Paul deals more specifically with the logistics of how this collection is actually going to be run. He's done his encouragements in the first 2/3 of the chapter. Now he talks more about Titus and how it's going to happen in practice, how this collection is going to be run. So let's read to the end. So I just read in verse 16, Titus, who's coming down, he's got that earnestness on their behalf. And so verse 17, he not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he has gone to you of his own accord. We have sent along with him the brother whose fame in the things of the gospel has spread through all the churches. And not only this, but he has also been appointed by the churches to travel with us in this gracious work, which is being administered by us for the glory of the Lord himself and to show our readiness, taking precaution that no one will discredit us in our administration of this generous gift. For we have regard for what is honourable, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. We have sent with them our brother, whom we have often tested and found diligent in many things, but now even more diligent because of his great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker among you. As for our brethren, they are messengers of the churches, a glory to Christ. Therefore, openly before the churches, show them the proof of your love and our reason for boasting about you. Now, we saw Titus is going down to Corinth, from Macedonia to Corinth. But he's not going alone, is he? He's going with someone else. And Paul describes him as, in verse 18, the brother whose fame in things of the gospel has spread through all the churches. Now, I don't know who this brother is. I don't know if any of you do, and you can tell me afterwards, but I don't know who this brother may be, whether it's Timothy or Barnabas or Silas. Don't know. I had a brief look around to see if anyone else online had any ideas, and it sounds like there's no consensus on who this brother is. Maybe it's Apollos, right? The great speaker Apollos. But Paul doesn't give us his name. Why might that be? I don't know. Maybe it's because he was well known to the Corinthians already. Maybe it's because Paul is trying to ward off any sort of pride or the idea of celebrity preachers that we see today. He's trying to avoid the idea of celebrity preachers, so he doesn't give the name. I'm not sure. We know that, for example, in the book of the Gospel of John never refers to himself personally. We assume it's not him anyway, that he says the disciple whom Christ loves, so it could be a humility thing, I'm not sure. But there is this other brother who is going with Titus. And as I mentioned before, Paul is very careful to not allow a perception to grow that he is somehow directly involved in this collection. He's not running it. He's not going to hold the money bag himself and walk around and insist that people give to this collection. And he's certainly not going to be the one who carries it to Jerusalem. What he said in verse 19, he says, this famous brother has been appointed by the churches to travel with us in this gracious work. So Paul's making it clear, this brother, whoever he is, it's not Paul's choice. He's been appointed by all the churches that he has gone through and running this collection. All the churches have given the consent their consent that this brother may be involved in this collection. So Paul, he goes on, he says in verse 20, he's taking precautions that no one will discredit us in the administration of this generous gift. So Paul is making sure everyone knows who's running his collection. It's not him. It's going to be people who are agreed by each of the congregations. They're all going to be happy that this man, whoever he is, or men, will be selected by the churches to run this collection. So these are the men going down back down to Corinth to run this collection before Paul makes his way down there himself, because that was Paul's intent, that he's in Macedonia and he will be coming down to Corinth in due course. He's sending Titus and the famous brother ahead of him with this letter as an encouragement and a reconciliation, and of course to get the collection back on track. So in verse 24, this chapter concludes with Paul encouraging them to say, show them the proof of your love and our reason for boasting about you. I think Paul, he'll be there, he would have been, assume he got there at some point to facilitate this collection with the support of the other brethren. He obviously felt like he could say these things, that they would come through, that he believed that because of this encouragement he was giving them, they would finish the task that they had set for themselves. And so I guess we've got to remember that, yes, the Corinthians had a difficult time with all the false teachings and errors. In 1 Corinthians that we read about, the man who had his father's wife, the idolatry, the issue with the spiritual gifts. They were saying, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Paul. That was all happening. He's dealt with all that. He's had his sorrowful visit. But when all is said and done, I guess, their sufferings were probably minor compared to what we read about in Macedonia, who are actually in deep poverty and affliction. And the saints in Jerusalem, who Jesus had prophesied would be suffering a great tribulation. I think we get, we're starting to see a really interesting insight into the culture of this congregation in Corinth. That they were not the same, all these congregations. They're not all the same. Corinth was a wealthy area, and they had an abundance, of spiritual gifts. And they were the first ones to come up with this idea of giving this collection to Jerusalem. They were the first not only to do it, but to desire to do it. So they must have had this noble-minded spirit in the congregation. But they're faced with these problems with some false teachers, some super apostles, and it's been a year and the whole thing's just sort of fallen by the wayside. It's been forgotten about. It's funny, I think. Do you remember how in chapter 1, how they had accused him of vacillating on his travel plans because he said he was going to go to them first and then he went to Macedonia first? And now here they've said they're going to run a collection to help the saints who are dying in Jerusalem, and it's been a year and they haven't done it yet. Who's the one who is vacillating? Who's the one's vacillating here? Paul doesn't bring that up though, does he? I think he doesn't want to hit him that hard over the head. But if anyone's vacillating here, it's the Corinthians, not Paul, in running this collection. And so I think, we can see this culture, and I think we see it in our culture today, right? Great wealth, great blessings, brings about a blasé attitude towards spiritual matters. And this is my view of what we read about in the Corinthians, that they had the great wealth, they had the blessings from God, and they had not been careful to stay vigilant and to stay diligent because they had these comforts. And I think that's all, in conclusion, that's a good lesson for us here today, that we are all in a wealthy country, that we all have blessings of God in abundance. And we of course, we face that same temptation, more so than churches who are in poorer parts of the world. We face the same temptations that the Corinthians faced in that regard because of the blessings, that they can be a double-edged sword. And so I think we can learn that from the Corinthians, that that's something that we face as a special temptation. We should always remember You know, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. That all of these blessings that we have are provisional, that are dependent on God's desire. He desires the best for us, but that doesn't mean that we have the physical blessings like the Corinthians had. And so in conclusion, we stay humble before God, we stay diligent, we are watchful, we study His Word closely. We be careful that we're not led astray by the physical blessings that we have, that in the end are just a passing blessing, that the real blessings and the treasures are in heaven. Thank you.